What's going on, everybody? Nathan here from Salty Productions, back with another Commander video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the current meta in Commander. We're going to be doing a little bit of an analysis based on the top 50 commanders and their winning strategies in order to intelligently build a defensive toolbox in order to combat what you might find in the wild. Before we get into the video, I'd like to ask, if you enjoy this type of content, please leave a like on the video and consider subscribing. I produce content like this on the regular. So the genesis for this video was around my current brewing process for Greymond Avacyn Stalwart. I'm currently building a mono-white humans deck that embodies a sort of quiet resiliency where we're mixing a pillow fort theme with a bit of a hate bear strategy in order to very consistently make it into the late game to present just enough of a defense to our opponents to incentivize attacks going elsewhere. When I think of this sort of strategy, I think of Richard from MTG Goldfish, where the way that you win Commander games is sort of just being as quiet as possible, sneaking your way to the late game by not drawing much attention, and also shutting off certain game-winning moves by your opponents. So in the process of this, I realized that while I do have a subjective understanding of the current meta finishers and sort of what the current decks look like out in the wild, I didn't have any data to back this up, and I wanted to have a sort of reliable, intelligent analysis to build these defensive slots around. So, if you're allocated 10 silver bullets to shut down certain opponent strategies, what is the best way to use those silver bullets? Now, the caveat with this is that everybody knows their current commander meta for your local meta. However, this is more intended to be for, if this deck is going out into the wild, what are the actual proportions of winning strategies you might encounter just in a random pickup game on something like Spell Table or something like that. So with that large caveat out of the way, let's actually jump into the methodology for this analysis. So in EDHREC, they list the top 100 commanders within the past 2 years, including their deck counts. And so what I did is I pulled in the top 50 of these decks in order to capture the majority of the meta that you might encounter, and then we dumped it into an Excel file. So let's jump over to that. So there's sort of 3 steps to this analysis. First, we plotted out the deck list themselves and their offensive strategies. Then we plotted out the proportion of those strategies, and we tried to come up with what are the silver bullets against these strategies to build out our defensive toolbox. And then finally, we took a look at the proportions of those defensive toolboxes, and in order to come up with a percentage that, if given a number of defensive slots, how many should we be devoting to certain strategies. So step 1 here was to pull in all of the deck lists. Now in column B we have our deck count, column C we have our commanders, and then we have our list of offensive strategies. With these types of analyses, there's always going to be caveats around the data. I will caveat that this is my own subjective interpretation of how these decks aim to win based on the following categories. So we have creature overruns, which will be essentially either big creatures that are looking to swing out with evasion, or just simple token sort of overrun strategies like a Jetmir Nexus of Revels type of deck. There are combo finishers, there are poison finishers and other +1/+1 counter finishers. There are instants and sorceries, which might resemble more of a storm type of deck. There are artifacts, there are enchantments, burn and drain strategies, super friends, aka planeswalkers. We have a category here for enters the battlefield and attack triggers to sort of mush together the Yarok, the Desecrated, and Ishin 2 Heavens as 1 type of decks. There are free spells, so these would be sort of like your Joda type of decks. There are card advantage decks that aim to essentially just outgrind your opponents into the late game by outvaluing them via card advantage. There are graveyard-based decks, so think Aristocrats and Reanimator type of of decks, and then big mana / landfall decks, which would be sort of your elves and Omnath type of decks. So let me just run through a couple of examples here for how these points are allocated. What we're trying to do is capture all of the strategies in a given commander. So for example, Atraxa, Praetor's Voice, is the most popular commander, and that's because there are really 3 deck archetypes built around Atraxa. There is Poison, there is Super Friends, and there is +1/+1 counter decks that all aim to abuse her Proliferate trigger. We're looking to capture all of these deck archetypes in this point allocation. So +1/+1 counter decks, we're definitely trying to overrun. There is some potential for combo, but a combo is not the primary win con for Atraxa type of decks. Atraxa is definitely trying to aim via poison finishers. There's a few instants and sorceries that are leveraged by poison and toxic style of decks, so we wanted to give a recognition there. Atraxa is in green, so it doesn't really abuse many artifacts and enchantments. It doesn't really burn very much, more sort of relying on that proliferate, and it relies on planeswalkers as well. So that's sort of what we're trying to do. So if a deck has either a primary or secondary reliance around the particular offensive strategy to close out the game, they either get 1 point or a half of a point depending on the prevalence of the finisher. There are also quarter points given to certain decks that rely on certain permanent types. So we'll see a lot of 0.25s here in the artifact category because a lot of decks that don't have green rely on mana rocks, soul rings, mana crypts, things like that to actually generate their mana base. And so I didn't really do that as much for like enchantments because mana rocks just are so much more prevalent in Commander. But if we take a look at another example here, we'll take like Wilhelt. So Wilhelt is often an aristocrat or token overwhelming strategy. So we wanted to capture, okay, we're looking to generate a lot of zombies and overrun with them. Wilhelt also has a lot of combo lines with things like a Rooftop Storm, Grave Crawler, and a free sack outlet. It also relies on artifacts to generate mana, and those aristocrat closers come in the form of things like Zulaport Cutthroat or Blood Artist, where we're looking to just loop a bunch of zombie deaths and translate that into damage to our opponents. And then it also relies on the graveyard for reanimation. And we'll cover maybe one more here. What's maybe something that looks a little bit more unorthodox? So like a Gearson Starn. This was given a half of a combo point because there are certain infinite combos with Gearson Starn. However, this isn't really its primary win con. Gearson Starn instead wins by ultimately just burning out the table. So it relies a lot on instants and sorceries for storm type of effects. It has mana rock, so it gets a quarter point there, and it primarily relies on burn and drain style effects. So once all of these points are allocated and tallied up, what does that then look like? So we sum all of the points at the top here, and then what we want to do is assign a weighting to those based on the prevalence or of the decks in the current meta. So what we're doing is we're essentially just multiplying the deck count by the point allocated here, which is in columns R through AD, and then that is going to give us a number that is just a weighted proportion of winning strategy within the meta. So these numbers don't actually represent anything. They're more just to compare against each other to arrive at the proportions. Okay, so once those are tallied up, we take that into step 2, which is to essentially stack them and rank them here in columns B through D. So we have our winning strategies listed out, those weighted counts, and then this is what I really want to pay attention to is column D. Again, these numbers don't really represent anything in particular, but what we want is to compare them against each other. So what this is suggesting is that the number one way that Commander decks will win in the current casual meta is with creature overrun strategies, followed by burn and drain style effects, followed by combo lines, followed by big mana type of decks, followed by graveyard strategies. Now, once we tally up all of our sort of material strategies, so anything that's sort of, once we get to 90%, I'm just going to ignore the other 10% because we really want to be only capturing the majority of what is in the meta in order to intelligently plot our defensive toolbox. So our top, 7 categories here gets us to 80% of the meta. So And this does seem to jive with Joey from EDHREC's data. So in 2023, he plotted all of his games that he played for Commander, and what we get is the following results. So this is from the YouTube video. We tracked all our games for a year. EDHREC cast 298, and this is from Joey's data around approximately 200 games or so. So we see that combat finishers represented about 54% of his overall finishes, followed by burn and life loss at around 31%, followed by combo, and then we have some all-win cons, so things like Approach of the Second Sun, and then there was also infect and commander damage. So the top two categories here is combat, burn, life loss, and then commander damage is a number 3. So that sort of jives with our data, although not in as much of the proportions. And that's, I think, just due to some inherent limitations with the analysis in how we're allocating points here instead of actually looking at like creature counts and things like that. But generally, I think what we can conclude from this is that the most of the commander decks in the meta want to win via combat, followed by various burn and drain effects. And if we look at sort of what are those effects, so with creature overrun effects, we really, the vast majority of decks have some sort of creature presence, and that would make sense because we are playing a format that's built around a legendary creature in your command zone that you're always going to be running out. And generally in Commander, compared to 1v1 formats, you want to have more of a creature presence just to have blockers, if anything, because you are facing 3 other decks that could potentially swing at you versus just one in a 1v1 format. So generally Commander decks will be running heavier on creatures compared to other formats. And then we also have the secondary sort of win con here is our burn decks. So if we take a look at this category, we have some partial points given. So I'm paying attention in particular to the Dragon and Miram Sentinel Worm when I say that, because there are several cards in Dragon and Miram decks that aim to burn out opponents based on like the number of dragons you have. I think there's like a 2-mana enchantment that I don't know off the top of my head, but that burns opponents equal to the number of dragons you control whenever a dragon ETBs. There's also cards like Red Dragon that is played by Miram that aims to essentially double itself via a copy via Miram, and then that will deal 4 damage to each opponent. So for any sort of secondary effect, we're rating it a half a point. And then there's several just other decks that aim to deal direct damage. So EDHREC will deal damage based on top decking. Will Halt type of decks will burn via the sack triggers from things like Zulapur Cutthroat and Blood Artist. Krenko Mob Boss has just some direct damage from like Perforos, God of the Forge style effects, and Impact Tremors types of effects where we're dealing damage whenever creatures ETB. So that's sort of, I think this makes sense based on what we're seeing in terms of how these commanders like to win the game. Now that takes us to the sort of last part of our analysis. So this one I think is the most subjective, and I like to provide a couple more caveats around how we think about defensive strategies. So with this, I am excluding one-for-one interaction because it's a bit of a cop-out, in my opinion, to say, oh, well, all you need to do to prevent, a game-winning spell is to counter it. Now, in a mono-white deck, there are some counter spells. We're already running all of those in the deck that I'm currently brewing, but it's just a bit of a cop-out to say, oh, well, how do you stop creature overruns? Just counter the Crater Hoof. How do you stop burn and drain effects? Just counter the Impact Tremors. So I wanted to exclude that for that reason. In addition, I think that it's important when you're pushing to the late game to not be one-for-oneing yourself. If you use a Swords to Plowshares on an opponent's scary creature, that essentially means that you are going 1-for-1 with that opponent and you're each going down a card. Now, compared to the table, the other 2 players by comparison are up a card, and so 1-for-1 effects actually are essentially card disadvantage in a 4-player game. So I've actually been moving away more and more from single target removal into more removal or silver bullets that don't necessarily one for one ourselves. So things like board wipes, things like sort of anything that affects the table overall that won't just shut off sort of one opponent. And so these are the various defensive strategies that I came up with. So you have fogs and damage preventers, creature-based board wipes. There is also a category here for creature pressure, and this was specifically implemented to counter the combo decks and the Super Friends style of decks, where really the best strategy to pressure a combo player to prevent the combo from going off is to pressure their life total so that they always have to keep mana up defensively, or essentially to just focus them first because they have the best way essentially to close out games in Commander as their primary win con. Then there are Linvala Keeper of Silence type of effects, and this is really just to shut off activated abilities. Activated abilities of creatures your opponents control can't be activated. There's only a few of these types of abilities in mono white, but here it is in our analysis. Containment Priest style effects, which essentially just shut off non-token creatures that were not cast. So this is a 2 mana 2/2 flash human cleric. If a non-token creature would enter the battlefield and wasn't cast, exile it instead. So this shuts off graveyard reanimation strategies and any sort of just put a thing on the battlefield from your library, like the Prismatic Bridge, or I think this actually wouldn't work against like Joda strategies because Joda technically just allows you to cast it without paying its mana cost, but this essentially just prevents free creatures from hitting the board. Rule of Law effects and anti-tutors. So Rule of Law essentially just says each player can cast more than one spell each turn. There's a few different effects like this in mono white. And then there are other anti-tutor effects like Aven Mind Sensor that aim to shut off searching libraries. Torpor Orb effects. So actually let me pull up, because we're in mono white, let's actually pull up the actual example here. So Alastron, Mother of Machines, is essentially a Torpor Orb effect by saying permanents entering the battlefield don't cause abilities of permanents in your opponent's control to trigger, so it shuts off ETB effects. There's also a life gain strategy just to mitigate certain, burn strategies. Life gain in particular is interesting because when you have an effect like Zulaport Cutthroat that is going pretty crazy by draining all opponents for one, the way that you actually beat that is to simply have more life than your opponents. Because if, assuming it's not infinite, a Zulaport Cutthroat effect that drains two opponents to basically KO them, but leaves you alive, actually helped you because it did technically just nuke two of your opponents. So that can be essentially the silver bullet against burn strategies. However, the caveat to that is that you typically want to keep sort of a low profile in Commander for most sort of mid-range matchups, because people will tend to attack the player with the highest life total. And so you want to be gaining life, but not enough life to actually cause attention on yourself to essentially mitigate all of that life gain that you've banked. So you want to be gaining life, but not too much life, if that makes sense. Then there are artifact and enchantment sweepers. Just generally, things in mono white will nuke both artifacts and enchantments. So I squished this category for both of these permanent types into one. So you have things like Cleansing Nova will destroy all all artifacts and enchantments, and then. So sweepers just generally tend to hit both. And then there are the grave hate effects. So this would be your graveyard exile effects like Relic of Progenitus, where you can pay one, exile it to exile all cards from all graveyards and draw a card. And if you wanted a more one-sided effect, there is Soul Guide Lantern, which allows you to sack into exile each opponent's graveyard, but you don't get the card draw. You don't get the card draw off of that. So that brings us to the actual analysis. So how do we actually beat a creature overrun strategy? Well, we can run fogs. And just a little bit of a note on fogs too. I find fogs really interesting, and I'm trying to experiment with running more of them in my decks because Similar to sort of what I just talked about with the drain effects affecting both of your opponents, if an opponent has a large creature board state, but it's not aimed at you, then that creature board state is actually in service of you by eliminating your other opponents. So it's almost interesting because fogs present a way to have your cake and eat it too, so to speak, by allowing your opponents to have these giant board states. But you essentially just turn off combat for you. So you allow these creatures to go attack elsewhere, and over the course of time, once this, if you have a deck that has a particular reputation, then your opponents might expect you to have a fog in hand, and they might preemptively attack away from you, knowing that their attack won't be profitable. But we can also mitigate big boards by obviously just board wiping, just generating some card advantage there. And I think that's pretty much it. Because creature pressure, I mean, we can have our own big board, but the assumption is that these big boards are going to, our opponent's big boards will have like a Crater Hoof or something that's going to be buffing them a ton. Linvala effects won't really apply, Containment and Priest effects, all these other effects don't really apply. So this is where I tried to very sort of meticulously allocate points based on how we can sort of mitigate some of these strategies. Burn and Drain, so this point is specifically for the damage preventers. There are certain cards in white, I think, that just say prevent the damage that would be dealt to you this turn, and I think there are cards without the combat damage clause, meaning you can just prevent burn damage. Or if you have something like protection, so if we were to look at a card like Sarah's Emissary, which is a classic finisher in white, you can just give yourself protection from a chosen card type, meaning you can't be dealt damage by the certain card type, which is pretty great. For burn, there's also life gain effects like we talked about to mitigate those, and then we have a half point into artifact and enchantment hate here, because if we were to look at our burn and drain style commanders that are looking to win with a strategy, a lot of them actually rely on artifacts or enchantments to actually facilitate the burn effects. So, for example, Dragon, or let's say Crinkle Mob Boss, has like the Impact Tremor style of effects, which are enchantments. Will Help the Rot Cleaver for sack looping relies on things like Altar of Dementia or Phyrexian Altar or things like that. Basically, artifact-based sack outlets. Goshintai is an enchantment-based deck. Prosper relies on artifacts and artifacts entering to deal damage. So it turns out that artifacts and enchantments actually deal a lot of the damage for these various types of burn finishers. And then finally we come to combo. Now, combo is really difficult to play against, to be honest. The primary reason primary way to negate combo decks is really to just hold up counterspells or any sort of instant speed interaction. And I did not have that category in this particular analysis. So with that caveat out of the way, the best way to pressure combo decks in a mono white deck would be to apply creature pressure against them and to also run Rule of Law effects to prevent multi-spelling in any given turn, and to turn off the ability to tutor for those various combo pieces. So that's sort of how we can best mitigate combo, although I admit that in this particular analysis, combo is very difficult to play against. With big mana effects, we ultimately want to be board wiping quite a bit. When I think of this, I think of elves. And let's actually jump over to our analysis here. Let's go to our big mana landfall categories. Landfall in particular is very hard to mitigate because lands are just so hard to touch without mass land destruction. But we see, for example, Lathrop Blade of the Elves relies on a lot of elf mana generating creatures. Crinkle Mob Boss uses big rituals such as Mana Geyser and Jessica's Will to generate a ton of mana and essentially just double spell, basically dump their whole hand using all of that mana. And then something like a Jisath Sun's Avatar is looking to ramp all the way to, I believe, 8 mana. I forget if Jisath is 8 or... Jisath is 8 mana, yep. And then you get this giant, payoff for playing your commander with the dealing combat damage. And then we have things like Korvold, which is just looking to generate a ton of treasures, Animar making all creatures cheaper. So what we see is that these decks are generally very very creature heavy, and so board wipes are a good way to mitigate that. Also, Linvala effects for any sort of activated abilities or mana dorks out there, and then rule of law effects for to turn off multi-spelling. So, you can't, if you play a mana geyser and you can't follow it up with spells, then the mana geyser is basically useless. And then we also see a lot of artifact enchantment hates. Like I was saying, you have your Prospers, that's relying on treasures. Corval's relying on treasures. Brea is an artifact-based deck. Niv Mizzet relies on those rituals. And then Carrick is looking to just sort of, make everything cheaper by eliminating the black pips. So that, and let me just cover graveyards, and then we can maybe move on to the proportions. So graveyard decks are looking to ultimately reanimate giant creatures or just spam a bunch of small creatures from the graveyard. So we can mitigate that with Containment Priest style of effects and just running Grave Hate. Board wipes do not work for certain because generally these decks want their cards in the graveyard, so it would sort of be against the strategy to put more cards into the graveyard. Okay, so then what we do is we take this sum that we have in row 3 here, and we apply a weighting to it once more to get to, okay, what proportion of defensive tools should we be running based on the prevalence of the various offensive strategies. And so that's what we have in columns Q through Z. And then once we take this and we plot it into our step 3 number here, sorry, talking too fast. So this is the primary output of our analysis. So what we have in column B is our list of defensive strategies. In column C, we have the weighted counts for how we should think about the proportions of these strategies. But again, column C doesn't really matter. It doesn't have any meaningful data for us. Rather, in column D is what we want to focus on by looking at the proportion of defensive tools that we should be using to counter this myriad of strategies. And also, I will say creature pressure is excluded from this analysis as a defensive strategy because in a mono white humans deck, we already essentially are going to be generating creatures and tokens on board as part of our offensive strategy already. So I wanted to exclude this from the sort of set of defensive strategies because we already have this inherent to the deck. So that leaves us with a simple input. So how many slots do you want to dedicate to defense in a given deck that wants to really survive until the late game? If we were to pick a number out of thin air, let's say 15. Then that gives us a rough guideline for how we should be mitigating our opponent's strategies for any deck that we might face out in the wild. And I don't think of this as sort of a hard and fast rule. Rather, I interpret this as saying, okay, well, for creature board wipes and fogs, maybe we can include this under one umbrella or one category. And so we're saying, okay, we should roughly be running 6 effects that hate on creatures in some way or protect us from creatures. We should be looking at 3 cards or effects that turn off multi-spelling or prevent our opponents from tutoring out their win cons. We definitely want to have a couple of artifact enchantment hate cards, whether that is sweepers in the form of something like Cleansing Nova or like a Stony Silence type of effects. We want at least 2 of those. We want at least 2 cards that allow us to deal with reanimation strategies or any sort of graveyard spamming strategies. We maybe want 1 card devoted to life gain just to help keep our life total healthy against burn strategies. And then maybe you run a Linvala, maybe sort of for any sort of mana dorks that you might encounter. So this is where, you can start to play around with these various numbers to arrive at what makes sense for your particular pod and what you expect to encounter in your games. So that is essentially the analysis here. And oops, I misclicked there. And again, this is meant to be tailored to any sort of deck that you might find in the wild. This doesn't really apply if you're looking at your specific local metas. And again, all of these point allocations are subjective. So if you guys want to sort of play around with this analysis, I'll have this file in the description below, and you can sort of download this Excel file and play around in it. So that is the video, guys. Hopefully you learned something out of this video. I think I will use this analysis to better inform how I build my specific hate bears in this mono white Greymon deck. And so yeah, that is the goal of the deck, is to survive until the late game, until we can essentially close out with mono white human overrun effects with Greymon in the command zone. So that is the video. If you guys enjoyed it, please leave a like on it. I always appreciate it. And feel free to subscribe if you like this sort of content. This took a while to put together, and I'll probably be uploading a future video in which I update this, or maybe incorporate the next top 50 commanders and incorporate them into this analysis. So again, that's the video, guys. Thank you all for watching once again, and hopefully I will see you all in the next one.